Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are listening to our wonderful webinar this afternoon in South African time. My name is Melusi Simelane, and we are here to discuss a very, very important conversation.
Evening, good afternoon.
It is an honor for me to be speaking to you on this very important topic. As someone who has worked extensively on human rights, and of course, as an institution that focuses on strategic education, we have seen firsthand how misinformation can be weaponized to silence voices, to distort realities, and to undermine fundamental freedoms. Whether it is disinformation targeting marginalized communities, the spread of false narratives just to justify oppressive policies, or the erosion of public trust in institutions. Misinformation is not just an inconvenience, as we will discuss today. It is a direct attack on our right to speak, to be heard, and to access the truth. This is why we are here today to discuss this very important topic. We are joined today, of course, by an incredible panel of experts who will bring deep knowledge and diverse perspectives on how misinformation, and of course, sometimes disinformation, can impact our societies. But most importantly, what we will do is find out how we can counter misinformation and disinformation. Their insights will help us navigate the complexities of these issues, from legal frameworks to media accountability to digital responsibility. As we engage in this dialogue, though, I encourage all of you on the attendees box and all of you watching us on our YouTube page to think about this topic critically and think about how we can uphold freedom of expression, particularly in our modern day democracies, which are very fragile, and then think about how we can overcome these challenges and how we can move forward, particularly moving from conversation to action. So let me first introduce my panel to you. I will start with you, Phumzile. Phumzile is a former member of Parliament of South Africa who has been in Parliament for quite a number of years, and she has worked as a consultant working on intersection of technology on human rights. She has also focused on countering disinformation, online threats, digital development, and internet governance. She has dedicated her career to combating disinformation, safeguarding digital democracy, and holding social media platforms accountable. She has also completed a fellowship on technology and human rights as a fellow at the Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, where she focused on the impact of generative AI and elections. Also joining us is Ngobile Nzindisa, who is an academic and a senior lecturer at the University of Eswatini, I still call it Swaziland, where she teaches journalism and mass communications. She's also a communications and media specialist who has worked in various areas in the country's industry. She has researched and published in health communication, media, and the application of technology in education. She's a PhD candidate at the Center for Culture, Media, and Society at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Last but not least, we are joined by Commissioner Chikondi Chijozi, who is a colleague of mine. She heads our criminal justice cluster here. She holds a Master's of Law from the International Human Rights Law in the University of Sussex in the in the United Kingdom. Before joining SALC, she worked as the Deputy Executive Director and Litigation Manager at the Center for Human Rights Education, Advice and Assistance, CREA. She's also the commissioner, as I've rightly called, the commissioner of the Malawi Human Rights Commission. So welcome to all of you. And thank you again for joining us for this conversation. Before we start, thanks. Before we start, I would like to pose a question first to Ngobile around this conversation around misinformation, disinformation. Perhaps I'm posing this question to you because you're an academic and you can perhaps help us understand what shapes public discourse in Southern Africa, often influencing elections, governance, and social cohesion. From an academic perspective, Ngobile, what are some of the most concerning trends that you've observed in the region on this topic?
Hi, Melissa. Hi, everyone, fellow panelists. Thank you for the question. I think for me, the biggest worrying trend is weak media literacy, media and digital literacy among the population. So because the population is so illiterate about just how the media works, you find that people are susceptible to issues of misinformation and disinformation. And because of that, then you see things like election interference, where you have foreign governments interfering with local elections. In some cases, we've seen a lot of that with the American election. Even South Africa was in the news when the elections were going on because some of these things were going on online. We see a lot of hate speech and division. That's concerning to me as an academic as well. Um, Especially in contexts where there's diversity and we are no longer celebrating diversity. So we see a lot of xenophobia, homophobia online, racist rhetoric because of the limited media literacy, I think, among the population. The thing with social media is that it has amplified voices that wouldn't otherwise be online. And so people are using social media, unfortunately, for things such as misinformation and disinformation, and that's a concern. Thanks, Nkemi.
Thank you. And I think you are speaking about the biggest concern, which is media literacy. You know, Africa has been the leading country in terms of consuming the digital trends that have been happening. But at the same time, the media literacy in Africa has been lagging behind. And I'll bring this to you, Phumzile, not so much because you've been a legislator and you know how we can legislate to govern on this, but I want to find out from you what you think has been the failures in these tech companies, what has been the failures in these media companies that have, for one, brought the innovation to us, which we do need, but also has allowed for hate to sort of proliferate.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and hello to everyone listening as well as my co-panelists. So kind of the broader philosophical question around disinformation in the digital age, in the era we live in, is the concept of truth, right? I think while the idea of the phenomenon of disinformation and lies and propaganda have always existed, I think now we live in an era where the idea of truth is now contested, which is a false notion, right? There are certain objective truths. The sun will rise in the morning. There's certain scientific truths and there's certain mathematical truths. But we're now in this era where social media has created the idea that objective truths can be contested. So what is required to solve this? It's a whole of society response. As Nobile mentioned, media literacy. That is one tool in the arsenal, making sure that people are not only media but digitally literate. They understand that online, people will lie to you. Not everything you see online is true. Not everything you receive on WhatsApp is true. But then there's also as governments establishing regulatory frameworks to hold social media platforms accountable, which is something that has been sorely lacking in Africa. The other jurisdictions have come up with laws and policies and regulations in place that hold social media platforms accountable. I think the kind of best example is the EU and the Digital Services Act, the DSA, which is a framework that puts very, very serious rules in place for when social media platforms do business in the region, where they can be fined up to billions of dollars, which they have. And that is something I feel as African countries, as Southern Africa, it's something legislators haven't taken seriously. So I'm hoping that what is now known as the Brussels effect, so the effect of the GDPR, of the DSA, kind of influencing across the geopolitical landscape, what countries are doing about platform accountability. I'm hoping that the wheel doesn't have to be reinvented. You can look at those laws and kind of adjust them for different countries. But I really think that one, we need our legislators doing that work. We need churches, communities, civil society pushing for media and digital literacy. So it requires really everyone to step in. But I think legislators have really dropped the ball for African countries, for Southern Africa. And I think just the global South in general.
And I think I'm happy you speak about the role of legislators. You, Phumzile, will not be a stranger to the whole Bell Pottinger saga in South Africa around, what many called misinformation. But that's a conversation for another day, or perhaps we can circle back to that. But I want to piggyback to you then, Chikondi, as someone who has been in litigation, as you work with us at Southern Africa Litigation Center, but you're also a commissioner at the Human Rights Commission. And I want to find out from you, based on what we're hearing from Ngombile and Phumzile, what impact have you seen in misinformation and hate speech, particularly affecting vulnerable communities, and perhaps where, as a Human Rights Commission in Malawi, or perhaps in the region, as you speak to your partners, you have seen the greatest impact of these disinformation and misinformation sagas?
Yeah, thank you so much, Melusi, and my fellow panelists, and everyone that's watching us around the world. In terms of the impact that I've observed, not just being at the Commission, but also looking at the trends that have been happening around the region, there's an increase of victimization and stigma around certain groups of society, those that are marginalized. And the sad part, Melusi, is that these things are being normalized to the extent that people don't see a problem to hate someone. That someone can wake up and just write something so hurtful to a certain group of society, and there are no consequences. And if anything, there are people that are supporting that kind of hate. And the most worrying thing is that it's becoming normal, to do that. And I can give you an example. Recently, we saw in Malawi a lawyer writing about street-connected children, that they must be killed, they must be fed to the birds and all of that. And there is no one who felt, not no one in all the population, but there wasn't like a public outcry to say, what was written is uncalled for. There's not been an accountability on the part of the lawyer who wrote that. The same thing we've seen, elderly persons being killed because of misinformation about climate change, people thinking, okay, so older people that are causing erratic rains and all of that stuff. And it's all coming from issues of misinformation. And a lot of elderly women in Malawi have been killed. But also when you look at the anti-rights movement, especially when you look at issues of LGBTIQ, we've seen in countries like Malawi, Kenya, Namibia, Uganda, laws that have been passed to target certain communities, and people in the increase in hate speech towards the LGBTI community, and people actually normalizing that. And it's a growing trend. And now with the Trump administration on the gender policy as well, has even further marginalized the LGBTI community. So for me, it's quite concerning. And especially for activists as well, because now the target is not just the community, but also those that fight for the rights of those that are marginalized. They become targeted, and it becomes risky, even for us as an NHRI, because we have a wider mandate to protect and promote human rights. But then when you start normalizing hate, because the people that are in these institutions are individuals that come from families, they live in society where this type of hate can also start to influence on how they perform their constitutional mandates. So everything is interlinked as to what happens online, what happens at community level, what happens at group level, at national level, and even at the global level. Because now with the Trump administration gender policy, it will start trickling down to states on how they deal with issues of diversity and the things that we have fought for so many years. And Melusi, that's quite really scary.
Yeah. And I'm glad you bring in the new phenomena that we're seeing in our friends at the United States of America. And I want to bring you back here, Phumzile, because again, as we touched briefly on the example of Bell Portinga, how do we navigate this situation where it's an actual threat to democracy? Because listen, a threat to democracy somewhere is a threat to democracy everywhere. When you are going to have powerful individuals in governments of powerful nations just waking up in the morning, as Chikondi is saying, they can say whatever they like, but forget about the marginalized individual who's on the ground. This is now a question of democratic institutions where trust is being eroded. And we are seeing, as an example, the Afrobarometer, the latest findings are that people in Southern Africa are no longer that much trusting of democratic institutions. And perhaps the people who have been in power are to blame. Perhaps we, the electorate, are to blame. But what sort of lessons can we draw, not just from the bellpotting situation, but also from what we're seeing with Elon Musk waking up in the morning and saying, oh, we've spent this much billions buying condoms. And then the next day he's like, well, we're going to make mistakes. It's part of the job. And it's like, but you are harming people here and you're also eroding in democratic institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the ultimate goal of at least if it's foreign influence operations, where we've seen great examples of that, of foreign influence operations that aim to, one, erode trust, as you correctly point out, in democratic institutions and democracy itself, that seek to reduce trust in government. And what you get then is societal divisions. And when is a great time to kind of control a public's discourse is when people don't know where to turn for truth, where you can't turn to government and say, this fact is during COVID, for example, if we say, what are the COVID infection rates? And we know we can go to, a government institution to get that information. So where that trust is broken results in societal polarization. And as Chikondi mentioned, the impacts go offline. It's not just, debate online where the public discourse is affected, where we're not able to have fruitful discussions. It results in death of line. It results in negative narratives about the LGBTQ community. It results in deaths. And I think in South Africa, to use South Africa as an example, the greatest example that I always provided about what social media can do is the July 2021 unrest, where civil unrest was inflamed online, and it had dire consequences offline, where, it was, what was it, 300 lives lost, billions and billions of rands of public infrastructure destroyed and businesses. So that's an example of what happens when disinformation goes unchecked, when incitement of violence online is unchecked. And I think what's happening now in the geopolitical landscape is yet another lesson of what happens when disinformation goes unchecked. For years, organizations like AfriForum and others have been spreading this myth of lie, of white genocide in South Africa. And what has resulted, here we are now sitting with, I always try to say this in the most polite way, Elon Musk and Donald Trump, two people that are otherwise assumed to be fairly
You can try to be polite because we don't want you living in the
fairly
US.
knowledgeable and wouldn't believe such a blatant lie, where it's affecting South Africa's standing geopolitically, where it could have dire economic consequences. And yet again, and what I've just been saying today is kind of looking at the way the media has covered AfriForum over the years, and where they've basically been stenographers of what they're saying. So that's yet another example of where a different part of society needs to play a role in combating disinformation, because they've allowed this, they've basically, I don't know if you've seen the news over the last while. AfriForum will say, no, we haven't spread disinformation, media headline. AfriForum says they didn't spread disinformation, but they have. So I think we can't keep going through these experiences where we are dealing with the consequences of disinformation and we hand-wring. It's an active, full-time duty to combat disinformation, to make sure laws are in place, to make sure that the media plays a role of not just reinforcing and amplifying disinformation narratives without correcting them. Otherwise, we deal with the consequences. And I think the great lesson for me, at least with the Balpottinger saga, was that it resulted in a South African population that is very aware of the concept of disinformation, where it has conscientized the public. I don't know, I guess you could call them if that is even a phrase, a country, a populace that is disinformation literate, where they, if there is disinformation, people react negatively to it. And it results in a situation where instead of polarizing, it unites South Africa around the truth. So I'm hoping that we do not have to keep going through these moments where we're like, oh my gosh, here we are again dealing with the dire consequences of disinformation, and there's more responsibility, and every kind of sector of society takes its responsibility around combating disinformation. And just to echo Chikonde's point that it's not just a phenomenon online, it's offline. It has offline consequences. It's fluid, it fueled public unrest in South Africa. It resulted in a genocide in Myanmar. In many, many countries across the world, it is having consequences offline, dire consequences. And we need to stop thinking of it as kind of a niche fringe-ish issue. It's central, it's a central issue to how public discourse is had, because when those discussions are false, it destroys the very core of society, it destroys democracy. So I really think we need to attach far greater importance to this information.
Yeah, thank you so much for touching on it. And this again is not to attack social media and the power that it has, because I mean, as you're talking about the July unrest, and we had something almost similar in Swatini, when this call for democracy, and a lot of the conversations were being held online. So I'm just trying to say, on the one hand, it can be used as a tool to mobilize, to bring people to the fore, to educate, but on the flip side, can be used to cause harm, as we saw in the South African example of all of those all 300 people that were killed. But I want to bring you in, Nobila, because you've been nodding along this conversation, and not so much because you're in academia, but I just want on the issue of this literacy, because Phumzile talks about South Africa learning so much from the Bell Pottinger issue. How to be sensitive to disinformation, and actually going beyond just the citizen, but the media, who actually play a very powerful role in how they can conscientize society on blatant lies, how they can conscientize society on information that seeks to deceive them or even silence them. So how can we make sure that our societies are literate, particularly as this thing can endanger our democracies?
No, it's a very good question. And before I even go on to it, Lucy, I like you have good panelists here because so when Phumzile is pointing out the issue of trust and the erosion of trust, for me it's an important thing, because we're speaking about misinformation now in the context of, for example, Trump, Elon Musk, and the things they're saying, but we haven't even discussed the issue of AI and its impact also, where we are seeing phenomena like deepfakes now. And it doesn't even really need to be Trump making a crazy statement anymore. He can be made to be seen to be saying something that it can have real life consequences, which we're seeing increasingly every day. And for me, that's the thing. And so I want to comment on that and say that I'm equally as concerned as Phumzile is that our legislators don't seem to be thinking about that in terms of regulation of the social media platforms, because there's a real danger on the internet that's lurking, but that has real life consequences in the end, as we see. And in contexts like ours, like in Eswatini, we are not even having these discussions, and that's the concern. Because at least in places where we've started talking about we need regulation, we can argue about what kind of regulation it is and what it looks like, and then we can talk about freedom of expression and all those things. But we are not even having the conversation. So by the time we catch up and we wake up, as usual, Africa, Southern Africa, even Eswatini, to make matters worse, will be getting everything that's already been defined for us. So even the danger will be defined for us when contextually things matter. And so in terms of your question, in terms of what we can do to sort of make sure that people are literate, look, it's a pity that we need money. Literacy requires investment. People are literate in the sense that they can read and write. And that's because governments have invested money to make sure that people can get that kind of education. But issues of misinformation and disinformation and the internet and all those phenomena don't seem to be attracting that same kind of concern from governments, and that's, for me, is a concern. So we need to make sure that people make investments to make sure that people are learning. I interact a lot with young people, and young people are online a lot. And it's concerning to me. I was just saying to a colleague that the way that young people think reminds me of an old man from the 1930s, even. And it's concerning to me because these are children born in 2004. So there's a source of this influence that they have. But they're in echo chambers, even online, where negative ideas are being spewed about different types of things. So there's no tolerance for others that are different in any sort of way. Beliefs, sexual orientation, all those things. So I think that yeah, we've got to the point where we've trained the media. We work with the media locally and we talk about issues of ethics. We've talked about issues of how to spot misinformation. But it is at the point where we need to be talking to the audience, because the audience first, there's the first problem of the journalism, the journalists who do what Pumzile says, parrot statements that are harmful in society. We try with ours because we're at the Department of Journalism and Mass Comm, and we have young people talking to young people with our radio station, campus radio station, UNESCO FM. So we try to make sure that you develop these critical thinking skills. You question sources, you question where, you just don't take things for granted just because someone said it and you trust this person, right? But the audience itself, because they also don't, journalists are also painted into a corner sometimes, I think, because the audience doesn't understand the role of journalism and its processes. So when journalists are still verifying stories, you will hear people say, no, that publication is captured, or they're not giving us the right side of the story. But the right side of the story that they're looking for is a story that confirms what they've heard, the misinformation they've heard. So I think it's a very big problem that we are not giving the attention it deserves. And I'm grateful for platforms like this where we can talk and share, because it seems to be a problem that's common across various contexts.
Thank you very much, Nobile. I love that very point at the end where you discuss how oftentimes the media can be pushed into a corner. I was talking to a friend of mine who's in the media in Swaziland, and she was saying, hey, why don't you put me as a panelist to speak on behalf of the media? And I can understand sometimes the media feels like they're under pressure, because you're right, the media must follow ethics. And sometimes as a society, particularly where the democracy itself is crumbling, we no longer trust anything. So anything that we see, if it doesn't align with what we believe is the right way to go, then we just say, oh, no, that's misinformation. That's a problem. And it creates a big issue for us working as the Southern Africa Litigation Center, for instance, and I'll bring you in, Chikondi, to touch on this, where we are now supposed to, on the one hand, make sure that we are protecting every individual in the exercise of their right to freedom of expression. But on the other side, we have to make sure that there's a line that they are towing. There's ethics, particularly if you are saying you're a journalist, there are particular ethics that you're supposed to follow. And even if you're just an activist like myself, you're just an individual citizen on the ground, you just want to say something, there's only so much you can say, because you cannot then defame other people. Chikondi will know that we're dealing with a defamation case in Malawi that's almost similar to this. So I want to then bring you in, Chikondi, to just talk to us about what sort of legal solutions do we have in how we battle with the issue of tolerance, the issue of ethics, and the issue of societies mistrusting anything that they hear? It's a very bloated question, and I hope you can tackle that.
I can see that. I can try to answer that question. Yeah. In terms of protection and the legal framework that is there to protect people from misinformation or hate speech. Of course, internationally, there's no agreed definition of hate speech, but you see that in the United Nations instruments, they refer to issues of incitement, discrimination, hostility, or violence. And also, there's a fine line between freedom of protecting the principle of equality and non-discrimination, and also protecting the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And I think that's where people have also had issues with laws that try to deal with the issues of hate speech, misinformation and disinformation, because they can be a double-edged sword where it can be used to infringe on the right to freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, and at the same time, it can also be a tool that can be used to protect equality and non-discrimination. And most of the times, these laws, as we're talking, they are put into place to protect certain groups of society, those that are marginalized, so that those that take advantage of them or use their freedom of opinion or freedom of expression to discriminate against other people or to incite violence against other people, those people are held accountable. Like you said, you've given the example of the case that we're doing in Malawi, where someone would feel that, okay, what the person said has the potential of defaming someone, but at the same time, the person is expressing their freedom of opinion and expression. So how do we strike the balance? Where do we draw the line? So internationally, there hasn't been an agreed position in terms of what hate speech constitutes. But I like what the United Nations General Secretary General had said in terms of the striking the balance. He said something like, addressing hate speech does not mean limiting or prohibiting freedom of speech. It means keeping hate speech from escalating into something more dangerous. So I think it's drawing that line where the example that I gave about a lawyer saying, let's kill all the street connected children because they're a nuisance. They're the ones that are vandalizing the streets. You know, what does that statement mean? It means any violence against this particular grouping of people is acceptable. And that's where we draw the line, that you can express your opinion about how someone conducts themselves or what they do, but it shouldn't come to a point where other people who feel justified to exert violence towards a certain grouping of people. I'll also give an example, Melusi, of South Africa. I think South Africa has progressed in terms of legislation. I don't know whether in practice it has actually protected the minority groups and people that it had intended to protect. But I think from South Africa, we can see they date back from 2000. The act called the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, which is called the Equality Act, which clearly prohibits hate speech and criminalizes hate speech. And we've also seen in 2024, another act was passed in South Africa, Prevention and Combating Hate Crime and Hate Speech. This is the Act of 2024, which actually makes hate speech as an aggravating factor for offenses like murder, arson, robbery, all those kind of things. So it's good progress in terms of the law, but then are people being held accountable? That's the big question, because having the laws existing and then those laws actually protecting people is another story. And another good example would be Kenya. In Kenya in 2008, they also enacted the National Cohesion and Integration Act, which also criminalized hate speech. And the act also set up the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, which actually investigated cases of hate speech online and resulted in 6 people being prosecuted for what they had put on social media. But then that act has also been criticized for being abused, and it's the same thing that we're talking about, drawing the line, that if there's this thin line between criminalizing hate speech and also stifling the freedom of expression. And we have also seen even the law itself that has been used to, enacted with the aim of protecting, that has been used to infringe on rights of even other marginalized groups. There was a case in Malawi where someone was actually charged with the offense of spamming because he had made a cartoon of the president. And when you look at the spamming, it's more to protect people, those that just send information about other people without verifying the truth or with the idea of just to spread misinformation or disinformation. But in this particular case, you find that someone was actually targeted more of a political kind of persecution. So yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a slippery one. It's important that we do it, but also being cautious of the negative impact that these laws have, because they are also prone to being abused by those in power.
Thank you very much for touching, I think, significantly on the issue of accountability, Chikonda. And I just wanted, before we can move into a more of a conversation that focuses on resilience, I just want to piggyback to you, Phumzile, on the accountability legislative framework that Chikonda is touching on. And I wonder if you can perhaps talk to us a little bit about the Xolani case, if you remember it, the former ambassador of South Africa to Uganda, which went all the way to the Constitutional Court. But also over and above that, on the question of accountability again, you've worked quite extensively with tech companies. What do you think should be done, or what do you think should be the role that civil society organizations like ourselves or activists on the ground can play in ensuring that your Meta, which we know they've just removed their fact checkers, which is what Chikondi was just touching on briefly, and we know that X is now actually a hate fest where people can just say whatever they want to say without any repercussions. But what can we do to hold those people accountable? But also briefly, the example of the Xolani case.
Yeah, I think we've hit a part of the conversation which I find just so fascinating, the intersection of technology and human rights. And I think you mentioned something really important earlier on, that social media is actually a really important tool for societies, particularly for human rights defenders. So I think it's important also to add to the conversation that if we're talking about regulation, we're not talking about chilling free speech. We're not talking about limiting, because I think that's how it's always misinterpreted, right? That we're calling for censorship, we're calling for people not being allowed to share their opinions. And I think that was what the Xolani case highlighted, right? We have to have very, very clear legislation or policies that very clearly define what is free speech and what is hate speech. That needs to be very clearly delineated. I think in my mind it's fairly clear, but it isn't for everybody else. I think, even philosophically, the idea of free speech, I may not agree with you, but I'll defend your right to say it as long as it causes no harm. And that harm, at least in the South African Constitution, is very clearly defined, incitement for war, no discrimination. So I think that is something that I find a little bit bizarre, that South Africa seems to be still grappling with in defining what hate speech is. I think for me, it's very clear. And I think that's what the Xolani case demonstrated. But the double-edged sword then, of course, is when the regulation becomes digital authoritarianism, where laws that are intended to guide against disinformation become abused, as Chigoda was mentioned, to kind of shut down human rights defenders. I think it's up to civil society, for organizations like yourself, to make sure that while those laws are being written, and legislators and opposition politicians, to make sure that those laws do not go too far where they start infringing on free speech. And human rights defenders are protected from repercussions, which is often what happens in many countries, where it's said, you are spreading disinformation, or you are spreading hate speech, or you are doing this, and then they are blocked from being active contributors to conversations, and they're arrested. So I think those are the questions that we need to be grappling with. And then also digital authoritarianism is not just only using legislation to shut down free speech. What we're seeing a lot of is also internet shutdowns, which is what Eswatini experienced, which was kind of a tool to shut down free speech. under the guise of, preventing incitement of violence, preventing, probably disinformation was probably used as a justification. So the fight against disinformation is also a fight against digital authoritarianism. It is a fight for protecting free speech. It is a fight for protecting human rights defenders' right to, raise human rights abuse, raise awareness of human rights abuses. It's a fight for making sure that internet access facilitates this. So for me, it's a very fascinating discussion. It is one that I think a lot of people are grappling with how do we allow technological progress while at the same time making sure that technology doesn't cause harm to society, but making sure that its benefits are society benefits from it. So I think there needs to be greater clarification of what constitutes free speech, what I don't want to say what can and can't be said online, but making it very clear that free speech is protected, but it must not become something that causes either physical harm or psychological harm in terms of, racism, narratives that are racist or that are homophobic, that are transphobic, that are xenophobic. So I think those are things that need to be made very clear, and need to dominate discussion far more, that we're not against free speech, we're against hate speech, and that hate speech causes harm. And here are the examples of the harm that it is causing or has caused in the past.
And it's interesting because it becomes very difficult to sort of thread that line. And I'm so grateful that you bring this up. It's something that, as Chikondi has mentioned, we're always grappling with at SALC in terms of how do you make sure that we are protecting the right to express oneself, but we're also mindful of hateful and disinformation that is harmful to our democracies. And you're right. The example in Swaziland where they shut down the internet, it's because of these arguments around, oh, we are trying to stop dissent. We're seeing the same thing in Zimbabwe currently, where a Blessed Mhlanga is in jail. And I believe a couple of days ago, they were back at the High Court for a bail hearing. And the only crime was that he interviewed a war veteran who had particular views against the president of the day. And for that reason, they've decided to jail the journalist. And it is quite shocking how this sort of threading of the line between free speech and making sure that you're not spreading harmful information can then be used and weaponized against us. And I want to take a question that's coming from our audience. This one is an anonymous, it's an anonymous question. And they're saying propaganda has been part of societies globally. We all have observed how certain news outlets globally will always report on issues, always taking a particular side. I know that is very true. And then they ask the question to you, Nqobile, where they say, how can we trust media if we can see blatant propaganda, misinformation? How are universities trying to curb this misinformation in the mainstream media? And I love this question for you, Nqobile, because I think academic institutions need to do something in terms of how do you, because look, just as a caveat to this question, I have been in conversations with some professors in Europe where they were discussing the whole issue of international relations, and where they've said the problem is that international relations have often been viewed from the Eurocentric lens, and no one is paying attention to what's happening in Sudan, for instance. No one is paying attention to the horrific scenes we're seeing in the DRC, the east of DRC. But all we're hearing about are the wars that are happening in Ukraine, which is terrible, or the wars that are happening in Palestine, which is terrible. But oftentimes there is a side that the media takes. So
yeah. Okay. Okay, so it's a fascinating question because this is an age-old debate that we have with students, with journalists. And I think fundamentally the idea is so we have to first understand the role of the media in society versus the media as business. And because the media is caught between these two things, it is a highly contested space. And so because it is contested, it's always going to be susceptible to either politics or political influence or business influence or whoever is looking to control the media, because once you control the media, you control the narrative, right? So the media is not winning this debate in any sense. And so because of what I think Phumzile was just saying, this to say that what is misinformation? You can say it, but not cause harm, right? And because of editorial standards, because of who you are as the media, are you a private entity, are you a state entity, you're controlled by what you can and cannot say. And so these are realities of the media that are there. And I think the audience needs to understand that it's not really the role of the media to tell us everything. So to tell us what to think, what to believe. The role of the media is to present sides to various sides to one story, primarily because no one media will be able to tell the absolute truth about a thing because of what I've just said, political influences, who's in charge, who's a patron, advertising. There's a lot of contestation around the media. So I think the solution around propaganda and issues like that is for states to understand that plurality is a good thing. Pluralism is a good thing. Media pluralism is a good thing. You need various sources of media. So you need lots of magazines that are not owned by one person so that the interests are varied, right? Sources of broadcast, we have many broadcasters that are not owned, that are not state, that are not private, but that are owned across, so that interests are varied. And because of that, the angles will be different. And how that helps is that all of these media entities will give a side to the story and allow the public to make their own informed view. And I think once the audience understands that this is the role of the media to present the facts, and then for us to draw conclusions, then it is easier to be able to say, even when you read propaganda from one newspaper, you're able to say, this is propaganda, there's a point missing, or there's a side of the story that's missing. I can get it from that other entity. Instead of writing off, a phenomenon we see in Eswatini is that people will often say, I don't even engage with that media house because it is owned by whoever, because it is affiliated to whoever, when it's the best we have in terms of plurality, unfortunately, and you can get glimpses of the truth, right? Yeah.
I'm sorry to jump in, Mobile, but it can equally be said that oftentimes those in power have often said, we are not going to work with media A, we are going to work with media B. And this is not a Swaziland phenomena, as we have seen recently, where the Prime Minister of the day attacked the media house. But it's happening globally, where we have President Trump just outrightly saying, if you're asking him a question that they don't like, they'll say, well, you fake news. So there is that attack of media houses on both.
Exactly. And this is why I say that the media is not winning anyway, because it's under attack from the audience. As the audience, we're calling them propaganda, but also leaders are also saying, I don't want to talk to you because you are not carrying my truth, right? So this is why we do, as again, this is where media literacy comes in, I think, where you're able to get sides of the story from different places. But if you don't even know to look for sides of the story, then it becomes even worse problematic, because you start tagging media entities as this or that, right?
So it's a question, thank you, Nobile. I'll go back to you again. It's a question of policy reform then, do you think? Is that something that perhaps as the University of Swaziland, or perhaps as you've engaged with colleagues across the region or around the world, that you are dying, and I'm sorry, that you are doing? And I'm thinking, apologies. And I'm thinking of community-led initiatives where we are trying to, that point that you touched on earlier of media literacy, and also to the point that Phumzile was mentioning, where South Africa had to be sensitive to the issue of disinformation because of a particular scandal around Bell Pottage. And I think there's a conversation that also been touching on. So is there anything that universities can do? Because we are now in an era where we all need to work together.
Yeah, I definitely think universities can do some amazing things, even with policy advocacy, because some of the problems have to do with how the laws are written. So, for example, in Eswatini, you could be saying something that's innocent and that's true, but that can be construed a certain way. And you could be in trouble because according to to the laws, it is construed in a certain way. So it says something about you and where your stance is politically, right? But I think for us as UNESCO, we've sort of focused because, like I said, we're training future journalists. And I think we are realizing greater impact by making sure that the people who leave our hands here are better trained. So through our radio station, we have students that are in charge of, we have news bulletins, right? And this is where news is important. But the students are in charge for news gathering practices, editing practices, and we make sure that ethically everything is up to standard. Because we say to them, if you bend the ethics here, you're not going to be a very good journalist when you go to the field, because the influences in the field are way, way, way more than even at this level where you're at. So I think that grassroots level, like at that, for us, and we have young people talking to young people through our radio station, and so they're able to say, no, you've heard this, but this is the right stance of it. It's not perfect, Melusi. We're working at it, because like we're saying, these are people who exist, who live online, and they are in echo chambers where certain things are being said and they're not necessarily true. So sometimes you have to even say, listen, you're a journalist in training, you can't think like that, right? And even in courses in class, the gender thing is a big thing, because we have a course called Gender and Media, and students take it in 4th year. But when you hear gender biases, and students are always shocked to realize, oh my God, I'm biased in that sense. But I say to them, and you're taking that bias into the field. So it is I think an iterative work that we have to do internally, perhaps ourselves, but also just make sure that even in the platforms where we're at, we're cognizant of what we're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chikondi, is there a role for national human rights institutions to play here?
Thank you, Melusi. Maybe before I answer that question, I just wanted to comment on what Ms. had said before about defining hate speech, having more, definitive description of what hate speech is. And it just reminded me of the non-discrimination clauses that are in various constitutions in our different jurisdictions, where states have used that to be the definitive way of defining what discrimination is about, where certain grounds are not mentioned in the discrimination clause, and then they feel that has been excluded. And I think recently we saw the case in Malawi, the Decrim case, where the court looked at the fact that because there is no sexual orientation in our constitution, then discrimination on sexual orientation is justified. So why I'm bringing that up is that sometimes having such kind of description can also be limiting and can result in further discrimination. And looking at hate speech and the impact that it has and how it is done. And we've seen, like, with the Trump administration, now it's being normalized. It's a policy now. So any government can come up and say, we only recognize 2 genders, and no one will have a problem with that. But then if we leave the definition of hate speech in the broadest sense as it is, it also helps us to look at emerging issues that are coming up. I'll give you an example. Like for myself, I personally felt like it was hate speech what happened to me, because I was chased out of my church because of the case that I was doing for LGBTI organization. And then when my daughter was still going to the same church, and when she wanted to participate in the church activities, she was told, you can't participate because you know why your mom was chased out of the church. And for me, I thought like, and that was said to her in the presence of her fellow church members, her friends in church. So she had to leave the church because of that. So for me, I felt like the way people looked at her, they looked at her differently. And even people that were my friends at church, they don't want to speak to me anymore because of that incident. So the pastor didn't have to stand up and say, stop liking Chikondi, or Chikondi is whatever. He didn't even announce in church that we don't want her in this church because she's doing this case. But the people that knew about it, they disassociated themselves from it. So it's things like that that they come out so subtle, but they become in their impact because it affected me psychologically. It affected my daughter. That's still, when you come to look at it, it can constitute still hate speech. So it's a very tricky one to like really define it because it can take different forms, as it were. And then also like commenting on what Kobile said about the media. Maybe you can come again and just maybe comment on the issue of ethics, because we're talking about the media reporting. Some would be reporting on propaganda, so you have like to fact check everything that you receive as a receiver of information. But then I'm thinking like, what is the responsibility of the media in terms of if you are being paid to say something that is false, where is your ethics? Because when you look at the media, people look at the media as a source of information. Like people, when we talk about freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, we're looking at also the right to receive information. And that's right. There's an obligation on the media to make sure that they bring the truth in the space. So if the media is going to be reporting that, oh, the LGBTI community are the ones that are spreading the spread of HIV, without any source of data to support that, where is the ethics? Where do you draw the line to say you can write as a media person information without verifying the fact, and the fact that you have a responsibility to make sure that people get information that is true. Now, answering your question, Melusi, on the issue of the NHRIs.
And before you do, I just wanted to say, I mean, obviously, from SALC, we are always with you in spirit, and I'm very sorry that you had to go through that. And I think a lot of people do go through that because this whole thing, and you mentioned earlier, and Pumzile echoed it, that this online hate can get real quick on the ground, on real individuals and real people who have real feelings, and it's really terrible. So I just wanted to extend my heart to that incident as well.
Thank you so much, Melusi, for that. Yeah, and I was just about to answer your question on the role of the NHRIs. I think as NHRIs, we have a huge mandate to promote and protect human rights, which is awesome. And now when it comes to issues of hate speech, I feel that as also NHRIs, we also need some sort of capacitation and also more of understanding of what hate speech is, because like I said, Melusi, there is a growing trend of normalizing it to the extent that those that are supposed to protect or to ensure that people's rights are protected, they also feel like, if I'm going to go into that space of protecting this person or this grouping of people, I'm going to be targeted, or I'm going to be on the wrong side of society. So people find themselves shunning away from things that they're supposed to stand for. So there's need to have a lot of solidarity within the NHRI networks at the regional level, even at country level, a lot of awareness, but also a lot of empowerment in terms of enforcement of the powers that the NHRIs have. Like I gave the example of the commission in Kenya, where they're able to push for prosecution for people that promote hate speech. But you find that most of it, and our NHRIs, our mandate stops at making recommendations. And that is based on those that are in power, respecting those recommendations. If they are people that don't care about whatever the NHRIs are saying, there are no consequences. So the issue of accountability still remains a big issue, Melusi, that as NHRI stand in the space to hold those people that promote hate speech accountable, the institutions in places where we have laws like in South Africa, in Kenya, in Malawi as well, how are we taking this law seriously? I gave an example of the street-connected children. We haven't seen the police coming out. These things are still on the page of the lawyer on his Facebook page. It's right there in everybody's face. But the police have not taken action, despite the fact that we have an offense under the electronic transaction and cybersecurity laws that criminalizes what happened there. There has not been any investigation. So it's because there's no lack of accountability. It also affects us to the extent in which NHRIs can be effective in combating hate speech.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'll come to you, Phumzile. I'll just read a couple of comments that are coming in from our attendees, and thank you so much for staying with us. We only have 28 more minutes and then we're out of here. There's Musa Nkosi who's saying in their view that self-regulation by tech companies has proven largely insufficient. While platforms like Meta, X, and TikTok have implemented content moderation policies, the enforcement has been inconsistent. So they say government and policymakers must find a middle ground between tackling disinformation and protecting free speech. And this is something that we've been discussing. And heavy-handed regulation, what policies should government implement to curb the spread of disinformation? And I just want to couple this question, Phumzile, with one who was asking also, how do we curb the problematic platforms? Someone was even saying, sometimes you're going to see, and this was Billy Masuku, who's saying sometimes you are going to see harmful content on X and you try to report, but nothing really happens. And that also anonymous attendee asking the same question about how do we mitigate hate speech. And I think there was also someone who asked the question, how do you differentiate between offensive speech and hate speech? And I think anyone can take that. But to you, Phumzile, how can governments or policymakers or institutions like SALC or activists like myself or anyone really do to make sure that we're holding these platforms accountable? Because I think it has to go beyond reporting an account.
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, it's like it requires a whole of society response. So I was at a conference in New York last week with a lot of leaders from across the globe. And what I realized was that a lot of work around platform accountability had been done before this global democratic backsliding we're seeing now. Civil society, governments had started regulating, which meant that social media platforms were a little bit afraid of what civil society would say if they did this, if they said that. Facebook, for example, was very responses that started to kind of put changes in place. And with the Trump administration, with Elon Musk coming in with his lax attitude towards content moderation, it feels like those gains have been reversed, where, the tech oligarch is back on top. And, we're all mere mortals that are subjected to their whims. So what requires is really just reinforcing that great sense of activism. It's just plain old activism. We as users are ultimately the ones, we are the product. We are the ones who ultimately make sure that, Facebook can generate profit, that Elon Musk can keep Twitter on. I struggle to call it X, Twitter. So it really requires more activism. It requires us saying, the fact that someone can freely call me the N-word on Twitter, that's not okay. What are we doing about it as users? I think the Tesla boycott has been a great example of what happens when the people say no. You need to hit them in the pocket. And I think what the EU has gotten right is being able to hit tech giants in the pocket. They are not afraid of giving Facebook $100 million fine. And what we need to be doing is making sure that it goes back again, I guess, to legislators and having those regulatory frameworks in place where they know that if you do not comply with EU rules and you're doing business in the EU, you will be fined. We need to have that in place. But just to go back to a point that Chikondi was making about your experience as a human rights defender, it's terrible that you've had to gone through that. But what's happening with online hate is that kind of campaign has been found to unfairly target women, human rights defenders, minority, kind of marginalized minority communities. And what's happening for women in particular is that there are now less women running for public office across the globe because of what we've kind of termed as gender disinformation or technology facilitated gender abuse or online hate against women, where it is shutting down the space for women to contribute to online discussions, to contribute to discussions around human rights abuses. And it's basically reducing the way that women are able to contribute to these discussions. So any discussion around disinformation, around online hate, around hate speech, we need to also talk about how it is having it is reducing gender equality. So any discussions around that, we need to consistently also add that women are disproportionately targeted, women leaders in particular, women in with women public figures are disproportionately targeted in online hate. So any discussion around that, we need to remember that. Yeah, I think just to go back to your question, there just needs to be activism. We haven't lost the fight, even though the tech oligarch is kind of back on top, and they've sidled off up to power. It's up to us as civil society, as organizations like the SALC, as academia, as governments, to make sure that we continue holding tech platforms accountable. That for academia, you do the kind of research studies that look at the impact of reduced content moderation and how it is affecting human rights defenders in Malawi, how it is affecting the citizens of Swaziland. So that type of research kind of bolsters the work that is being done, what we're saying about the importance of content moderation. So I think it's really up to all of us to continue saying that we need to have proper content moderation. We need the content moderation that was on Twitter back in place. It is harmful. We need more done against online violence against women, and to restore the balance of power, and for us to ultimately remember that at the end of the day, as a people, we have more power than the billionaires.
I love that. We have more power than the billionaires. We can attack them where it hurts the most.
We can tank Tesla.
Well, we're not inciting. We are not
We're not
inciting.
inciting, but we just need to be activists. And a consumer boycott is an example of great activism, not violence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, look, we are coming to the end, and I'll just encourage our attendees to write any question that they have on the Q&A box. But I just want to, because we're coming to an end, if anyone can, perhaps Chikondi, you can touch this one, the difference between hate speech and offensive speech. And I think I know who this anonymous person who asked this question is. They said they're at work, so they don't want their boss to know that they're watching this work. So thank you for staying on. But they want to understand the difference, because I think it's a very thin line around how you can say something is harmful. Because, and I think, Chikondi, it goes back to this case we're doing in Malawi on defamation, where you can say someone is defaming me, when on the flip side, someone might say, well, I'm just expressing myself. I mean, equally, there's a case in Botswana that we've been doing. It sort of has died out, where the government charged a journalist for publishing alarming information, merely because the journalist was covering a story around perhaps a corruption scandal. And we see this a lot. So then we have to ask ourselves, was it harmful content that was published, which then the state might have the power to curtail? Or was it just offensive content that was being published that the government might not want us to know that maybe they're squandering money? So what's the difference? Offensive, hateful, offensive, harmful?
I think, Melusi, you've answered that one. It's a very thin line
Yeah.
between what is offensive and what is hurtful. I think it reminds me of a conversation we had in one of our meetings where we were talking about one of our clients who had who had said that all female judges in Malawi are not beautiful. You know, they of course, those that are in the judiciary might have taken an offense with that. So we're like debating whether that could be hate speech or offensive. So it depends on which side or how you're looking at it or how it affects that particular person. But it's really difficult to draw the line. I think what has with the main difference maybe would be the fact that hate speech is more on the violent side, where what you say has the effect of inciting violence against the people that you are saying the hateful stuff about. But at the same time, like I gave the example that I gave about my situation is how I feel, or if society starts to treat me differently because of what you're saying. Like Melusi, we've seen with the judgment in Malawi, the decree judgment, we've had reports from the LGBTI community saying how before the judgment, they were able to access services like healthy services, but now when you go to the hospitals, they're not able to, access services. So sometimes it may be a statement that can look to be hurtful or offensive, but at the same time, the impact can be the same as what is regarded as hate speech. So really, I can't give a definite answer to say these are a list of hate speech, this is list of offensive speech, but it's the impact, I think, that whatever is said will have on the recipient of that information.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say that I can see Judge Ntaba is on the attendee list. Judge, if you'd like to perhaps say a word or two, please raise your hand. I don't want to put you on the spot, and then I will allow you to speak. But I think with that said, I will just ask the one last final question to everyone in terms of there's a question from Velaphi Smelane who is saying it's sad that our governments are are enabling hate speech and misinformation by not acknowledging the existence of what they term minorities. This prevents legislative reforms that would be inclusive. And thank you for that comment, Velaphi. And I just wanted to ask this sort of final question. Judge, if you'd like to just say a few words, I would like to invite you in as a panel. Judge Ntaba is here. But I'd just like to ask the final question to all of us in terms of what do we think then should be done by all of us? Is there any sort of actionable way forward coming out of this conversation? What is the most important takeaway from this conversation? But before, Judge, would you like to say something to us about this phenomena of hate speech?
You like putting me on the spot, don't you? I thought I could stay anonymous and just listen.
Yeah, this is Judge Ntaba from the High Court of Malawi.
I think the problem that we're facing, I think in the human rights era, in this time of ours, is this pushback by radicals, fundamentalists that seem to believe that it's only their way and not the concept of what we try to put up as a humanity perspective. Even let's take away the human rights aspect of it and just deal with the humanity aspect of it. Or if you look into the African context, the concept of Ubuntu as it stands, and then you are dealing with all this in a space where there's so much that is also competing with the concept of human rights. You've got wars, you've got famine, you've got cyclones. And then it begs the question from all of us, what can we do to ensure that we continue to protect the people that need to be protected in the spheres that we work in the spaces that we are at, and more so in the country, as so to speak. And I would always say that I think it really does need for us to have concerted efforts and making sure that we speak where we need to speak at, advocate where we need to advocate for, lobby when we need to lobby, and take litigation when we need to take litigation, because I think sometimes everybody also shies away from litigation as it stands, because it's you're also dealing with a very strict interpretation that has seemed to have also come into the spaces that we're at. But what I realize with litigation is the fact that it raises a profile and gives us the ability to highlight the issue from a perspective of human rights. And I think if we continue doing it from that perspective, we will get people to do more protection, even challenge the people who are actually doing the hate speech, the ability for them to be challenged within the law space, the legal space, and also to have that voice for them to put it into context that they can now. Sometimes they like hiding behind, oh, it's the church and all those things. But when you bring them to the forefront in terms of the law, if you sue a certain minister, you make a suit for a certain religious person, they do not necessarily want to be put in that particular space and be made to account for the kind of hate that's being spewed out. So I think we just need to be more focused, strategic, but don't forget that we could always use our biggest weapon, which is our Ubuntu, which is based on our customs on the African space, on the African continent, to actually help us to underscore the concept of humanity and why a person needs to be protected for just being a human being. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Judge. It's always refreshing when you hear a judge say, let's fight them with Ubuntu, not saying, bring the case to court. Let's deal with them. So thank you so much for your input, Judge. I'd like to invite all of my panelists now for just a final word. But before I do that, there was a comment that said, I like Ngobila's point about the link between media and business and media and society. This has left a podcast to mushroom. While diversity within media is always good, how do we make sure that podcasts and other media platforms, like this webinar, I suppose, which are largely consumed by us young people, are regulated and do not add to the misinformation and disinformation, and how we can ensure that they do not directly or indirectly spread hate themselves? I think that's a very good question that we should have looked into around regulating the mushrooming podcast. And I would love for to be moderated. But can I just put these last two questions to all of my panelists to just say, how do we moderate podcasts, but also what's the action point moving out of this conversation? What should we all do? I mean, obviously, as the Southern Africa Litigation Center, we're always ready to work with grassroots organizations. We're always ready to work with the media. We're always ready to work with activists to ensure that we're capacitating them on how they can grapple with these issues. And if needs be, we're always ready to take cases. Perhaps we won't bring a case to you, Judge Ntaba, because you've been tainted by being a part of this conversation, but we're also happy to take issues up to your SADC PF, to your SADC tribunal, which is no longer existent, sadly, but to your African Commission or even the United Nations. So last final question to all of my panelists. How do we move forward out of this?
Maybe if I can just jump in here, Ngani, because Chikonde had mentioned about media that lies and lies. And I think that's the challenge with the mushrooming podcasts, but also these mushrooming news sites. Because you go on Facebook and you see people are claiming to be a news site, but when you look at the content there, it's very problematic content. It's misinformation, it's disinformation, it's hate speech, it's all these things. And I think this is the problem that journalism is facing. I have no idea what you're going to do with it, because if you're a legitimate journalist, you subscribe to journalism ethics. And unfortunately, ethics are not something that you can then litigate with, because, and with dealing with a lot of people, you see that people are shifty about ethics now. So it's not a problem to lie about somebody anymore, which is a problem because this is not what journalism is. And so I like what the judge was saying about we do all the things, advocate when we need to, litigate when we need to. I think it is necessary to litigate sometimes, and not to be seen to be advocating for media regulation, because even that can be problematic on its own. But sometimes I find that in avoiding media regulation, we give space for some of these problematic views. And I just want to point out that, and the problem is that it affects us, our field, because it erodes the public trust. When people think or feel that they cannot trust journalism because it is offensive, it propagates hate speech and misinformation. And I think the public should know that they can take things up and sue organizations for things like slander, for things like defamation. I think we should be talking about things like that and saying that those things are okay, as long as it is not governments now suing media for defamation when they're trying to hide issues of corruption and things like that. So I think it's a catch-22 situation that journalism just finds itself in. It's a terrible crossroads that we're in, and we should be thinking about what to do, but we're in it. So I don't know. I'm open to suggestions.
Yeah, if I can jump in,
Yeah.
I think it's a very difficult time for the media. It almost feels like one of those thankless professions where you're always going to be criticized. Um, I think it's this, when we're talking about the media, and I know I mentioned earlier that they need to take on a far more responsible role in not amplifying disinformation. At least I spoke about the South African media and how they've reported around AfriForum. I think another dimension we need to consider is the fact that, the media has faced declining resources, and to survive, a lot of them have to kind of exist around paywalls. And the unintended consequences of that is that there is less sources available to verify information, where now you get the burgeoning of these news sites that don't fall under kind of self-regulatory systems, at least in South Africa, that I understand the difficult position that the media is in. I understand the decline in resources, and I understand all of that. But I think, again, it almost sounds a little bit kind of esoteric, and it doesn't sound like a real solution, that we all need to be activists. And I think that's the point that Judge Ntaba was speaking to, that Ubuntu. It's really just up to all of us to, if you have a social media platform, to kind of instill in others that, that there'll be disinformation online, expose disinformation. I realize what I've become for my small community on WhatsApp. I've become my mother's friends group fact checker. So she'll always send something to me and be like, "How is this true?" But with all her friends knowing that they can go to my mother, and she has this daughter who checks this thing, it has a butterfly effect, right? Because when I correct that, it corrects it for that other WhatsApp group, and the truth spreads in that way. I think it's just up to all of us to just insist on not being lied to. If a podcaster is spreading a lie, there's the Broadcasting Complaints Commission, at least in South Africa. Report them to that. As a user, say, post a tweet, or on Facebook, say, "This thing said by podcaster X is a lie." Those little efforts, they may seem like, "Oh, it's just me, I'm just saying this, it doesn't have an effect." It does. Because even though lies have longer feet, and lies are more likely to become viral because of the way algorithms work, they prioritize content that is controversial, and content that is often controversial is content that is disinformation or a lie. So I think all of us, let's just do what you can. You don't need to be myself working in the field. You don't have to be an academic. You don't have to be a lawyer. Just as you taking this personal responsibility to really make sure that what is shared online is truthful. I think once we all start taking that responsibility, I think we can challenge that problem, because we can have all the laws in place, we can have all the greatest academic papers, we can have the greatest journalists, we can have amazing courts, but if the people themselves do not do that work, none of it is going to work. So I think we all have this personal responsibility to correct falsehoods where we see them, to feel a sense of ownership of our public discourse, of our social media spaces, and make sure that we do our bit. Every small action counts.
Thank you. Chikondi.
Yes, I think Pumisile has just sum it up all. And I don't know what to say after that, because I think what the judge said about Ubuntu, as well as all of us taking responsibility, I think that's the way to go. And we need to understand that it's not okay to hate, you know. We can't normalize it. It's not normal to hate anyone for whatsoever reason, because today it might be this grouping of people, next day it's going to be coming home, you know. We've done so much to be where we are today. We, like, looking at the panel here, we are 3 women here, you know, and years back it wouldn't be the situation, you know, and these things can be reversed any day if we allow hate to continue in that sense. So I think we need to take it very personal. I always say that when you look at human rights or anything that happens in life, you have to take it personal. That if it was happening to me, how would I want to be treated? If you not like it, then don't do it. If you not like those things being said to you, then don't say it about someone else. And that's what Misila was saying about taking responsibility and Umuntu. You know, the same narrative that had been going on about all LGBTIQ concepts are Western culture. Newsflash is now the gender policy says that 2 genders. So where are we going to go with that narrative? Because I mean, we have always been a society, African society, that embraces everyone. And so let's be true to who we are, and share love, and not hate anyone. Yeah.
And stand up for each other. You don't
Yes.
have to be female to stand up for females. You don't have to be South African, stand up for a South African. You don't have to be Swati to stand up for Swati. Yeah.
Exactly.
You don't have to be a woman. And Chikondi was saying this is a woman on the panel. So, okay.
What are you? You're the rose amongst the thorns.
Listen, but thank you so very much for taking the time to speak to us this afternoon. I just want to quickly give a shout out to Matthew Hudson, who was actually the first one to join us, and they are still here listening to us. And a quick shout out to Cynthia M, and I believe it's Cynthia Mkoko, who actually taught me English. So if I butchered English, it's her fault, because she taught me English at the University of Swaziland. But thank you so much to our beautiful attendees who have been here. And for me, just a last word, I would say, can we please harness the insights from this conversation and turn them into impactful actions that spark real change? We can transform our shared aspirations into tangible results by nurturing ongoing dialogues, collaborations, and accountability. Emphasis on the accountability part, because together we can build a strong foundation for lasting engagement, ensuring that every step we take is purposeful and aligned with our vision for a more just and inclusive future where our democracies flourish, where the right to expression flourishes. So exciting times are ahead of us, and I can't wait to see what we can do together moving forward. So thank you so very much, Phumzile van Dam, Nqobile Nzinisa, Chikondi Chijozi. This was the Southern Africa Litigation Center speaking to you about addressing misinformation for a democratic future.
Thank you.
And thank you for hosting this amazing discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. Excellent.
Very
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.